Hi, my name's Lee Biggeden. I'm the co-founder of Nephos Technologies. Nephos Technologies are a data services integrator, working with organizations to solve an array of complex data problems, ranging from delivering high-performance infrastructure to support AI and ML initiatives, through to data governance and privacy services, to working with customers to help kind of drive more value from their data by removing some of that data fragmentation that many people suffer with. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by Charles Southwood, the Regional VP of Northern Europe and Middle East and Africa, or of Denodo, for today's Q&A. Today, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the data integration aspect and touching a little bit on data mesh and data fabric, obviously a hot topic for a lot of people out there right now. So welcome, Charles. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here, Lee.
Thanks. And I guess to kick off, before we dive into the detail, Charles, it'd be great if you could give us a quick intro into yourself and Denodo.
Yes, of course. As you mentioned, I'm the Regional VP responsible for our business across Northern Europe, Middle East and Africa. I've been with Denodo now for almost 6 years. I have a background in on the vendor side for the last 35 years, mostly around middleware and particularly around middleware related to data issues and data solutions, data services, data web services and general integration needs for business. And this is obviously a hot area now we're finding at Denodo. So great to be with you, Lee, and to join the session today.
Thanks. Thank you for doing it. So I guess to start with, I mean, data integration continues to be a challenge for companies across the world. You're obviously experiencing this firsthand with many organizations that Denodo are working with. What is it? What needs do you see coming from kind of company execs that you're dealing with?
I guess we're very fortunately, because we get an opportunity, as do you at Nephos, of talking with sometimes many hundreds of different companies about their challenges, and this gives us a sort of broad perspective. It does vary, but I would say some of the common themes we see from organizations when they approach Denodo to help them with their data integration needs include, first of all, areas such as silos, where either they've acquired companies or departmental functions have meant that they've got solutions restricted to certain areas. So data silos is definitely up there as one of the big problems. We also see a lot of legacy, particularly in larger organizations, where the applications sometimes haven't even been designed for integration and cooperation with other systems, and they present challenges. Also, getting themselves off those legacy platforms can be very complex, particularly where you perhaps don't have the same level of support that you had previously. And then we also see challenges around cloud, both in terms of the journey to cloud, the migration itself, and also when they get there, quite often organizations have got disparate data, which is perhaps some of it is, as I was saying earlier, legacy or in silos elsewhere. There may be external sources. And whilst the principle of putting data in a single place is a great idea, we all know everyone's been challenged with that for the last 30 or so years. So hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, many of the large organizations are across multiple cloud providers. You've got software as a service, which is yet another area of fast growth, but of course now you have more data in the software service application, and then bringing that together with what you've put in the cloud in different buckets and legacy and size, all of those sorts of issues, I guess. The other thing to say is that the volume's going up at a level which means that the old models of moving and copying into a single location are also becoming an increasing challenge for organizations. Batch runs take too long, it costs too much. And I think it was Forrester, one of the analysts was talking about data being copied 7 times across the enterprise as an average. I think it was TDWI, the benchmark specialists. Yeah. So lots of issues, I guess, and those are the kinds of problems that people typically come to us to help solve.
Yeah, and we see similar things, right? I mean, I think if you look at most organisations, that fragmentation of data is a continual problem for them. I mean, in unstructured data, we see it. Most firms are storing at least 5x the amount of data that they need. There's a lot of duplication and replication, I think, and that bleeds into the data quality problem that most people have, and and it kind of compounds, right? It's a big problem for people. So all of that. I mean, I guess when it comes to scalability in these sorts of projects, how important is a good data governance strategy? How critical is that, do you think?
Oh, I think it's key, and a lot of the requirements have their foundations in compliance and governance and security. Firstly, from the perspective from the importance side of things. Clearly, with GDPR and other regulatory requirements, a lot of compliance, particularly in financial services, all of these are driving an appetite to have better control of the data. But that, of course, is coupled with the difficulty of this disparate nature of the data, and the move and copy that we were talking about a moment ago, I think is also a challenge, because once you start to move the data and curate it into new locations, and then from there to another, you lose the provenance of the data. What was the data originally collected for? What were the permissions that were given around the data when it was collected? What was the context? How out of date or up to date is that data? What should we rely on it for, and so on? So there's a huge issue, and I think certainly with data virtualization, the principle is that you have this layer between the data sources and the consumers, and by bringing that layer together as a centralized capability for governance, you're able to see the data flowing from the original sources to the consumer, and that allows for a greater level of governance. And of course, as you mentioned scalability, as the volumes go up and the disparate nature of the data gets broader, multinational, you have sovereignty issues and so on, being able to have a single layer that can manage the governance is very important. You don't want, if you're a large organization, to have the regulator come and say, well, yeah, you've taken that person's details off, but can you prove that that's the only location where those data sources exist? And it's that kind of thing which can create real challenges for organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's I think the other outside of governance itself, from a regulatory or compliance perspective, I think it also causes a challenge when you look at from a data quality perspective. And as you say, as you're replicating and creating these silos and pockets and fragments of data, where you lose the provenance, you potentially also lose the quality, right? I mean, and then at that point, if you start looking at running models against data that's inaccurate, then rubbish in, rubbish out, and all that.
Yeah.
For want of a better way of putting it. But yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, I think from your perspective, what options are companies looking at when they're thinking about connecting these disparate data sources? Like, how are they trying to bridge those data silos? What do you see there?
Well, I think there are different models depending on the type of consumer. So where you've got business users and people running the typical visualization tools, the Tableaus, Power BIs, Clicks, Looker, etc. I think predominantly we see the older models where people have ETL and data warehousing. So they'll take the data from multiple sources, they'll have a batch process, typically overnight, and they'll curate the data into a single source that can then be used by the users. So they get the users to point to this data warehouse or enterprise data warehouse, so that they've got a one-stop shop for the users, and that has its advantages and disadvantages. I'll come back to those in a minute, but that's one model. Then you have the more advanced users who are looking for new insights and new models. They tend to be the data scientists, the advanced analytics users, and perhaps people working on AI and algorithmic businesses. In those instances, typically they want to go to source because they're looking for new combinations. And the challenge for those people, of course, is that they need InfoSec permissions to get to the data. They don't always know where the data is. And if you talk to a typical data scientist, I would say probably 70–80% of their time, sometimes more, is spent collecting and preparing data rather than doing the data science. So there's a challenge with that model. With the first model, it sounds okay, but we hear a lot from executives about the timeliness of the data, the speed with which change can take place. And going back to TDWI, the benchmark specialists, I recall they said that a new dashboard content, so adding something into an existing dashboard, typically takes up to 2 months in a large enterprise. And that just isn't really wholesome, particularly when you look at the speed of business these days. So those are the two models. You've got bring it all together, or a kind of potpourri, help yourself. The third model, which we're seeing increasingly, uses data virtualization as a technology. And this is where you don't move and copy the data, but you put a virtual layer, like the Denodo technology would sit over the top of all the data sources. At development time, you make a connection to the sources, and then the curated version of the data, if you like, the semantic model inside the layer would be created and exposed to the users. So when your BI user looks down on the Denodo platform, it looks like that someone has created this wonderful enterprise data warehouse that has all the data, but in fact the data doesn't exist there at all. It's just metadata, and all the data is sitting in the source. I sometimes use an analogy of solutions like Netflix and Spotify, which most of us now use in the home. If you're using Spotify, you don't actually have any music there. You no longer have your DVDs and your CDs on the shelf, or your tapes or records. It's somewhere else, and you don't really care where it is. You don't mind, as long as when you look at that metadata and you have hundreds, thousands of songs to choose from, when you select it, in real time, it gets the data and brings it to you. You consume it. Perhaps you listen to your music or watch a film, you listen to your music, and then it's gone. If you need it, you get it again. And so the volumes of data that need to be held locally, of course, are very small. And it's exactly the same with data virtualization in the enterprise. So why would you not include that type of technology in your platform? So coming back to your original question, it's a long answer to a short question. Those are the options, and yes, there is a role for an enterprise data warehouse. We wouldn't say otherwise, because you've got to hold data if it's not persistent source for historic and trending purposes. So you still want to do some ETL data warehousing, but you don't need to have a model where you're copying everything overnight just on the off chance that someone might want to watch it. You can virtualize it, and then just users can get the data where they want. So your business users get it in the same way that they would do from a curated enterprise data warehouse, and your advanced users, your data scientists and analytics users, are able to easily look at new combinations of data and drill down into the detail without having to spend the 70 or 80% of their time preparing and collecting the data. So,
yeah. No, it's a great answer. I mean, I think, and you touched on one of the prime use cases. I personally think this plays really well into earlier around M&A. You know, I was chatting with someone recently, and they're heavily acquisitive as a business, but their model is that they leave the acquired business alone, effectively. But from a board perspective, they still want to see what the numbers are. Yep. Still want to see what all of those reporting elements that they need. But they can't move the data necessarily. They can't transform that right now. So, you know, those sorts of use cases where you're able to bring that together in one view without the lift and shift of the data itself is I think a really, really powerful thing in speeding up kind of time to value out of data generally, which is ultimately what everyone's about, right? Everyone wants more from the data faster. So,
yeah, I mean, we actually have. So we have a lot of organisations that are multinational, and the other aspect to that, of course, is data sovereignty. There are many countries which won't allow data to leave their shores, but if you virtualize, when you abstract the data into a concluding report, you can take the sample of data in real time into that report, and you're not moving and copying bulk data from the sovereign state into another location. We've got a number of large multinational banks who use us across their global enterprise. In fact, 3 of them are in the top 10 of global banks in the world. So certainly scalability that we were talking about earlier is an important aspect. But if someone say the CEO of one of the big multinational banks says, okay, so what's our risk profile given the issues in Ukraine? Collecting that information, if you don't have a system like Denodo or the data virtualization capability, can take you weeks to get that information together. And people need it in a timely manner. And it's the same with COVID. You know, we saw data virtualization being used to provide information to the First Minister in Scotland using the platform. So these are very powerful use cases, and they need to be up and running quickly. And it's the agility, I think, that really drives the appetite to virtualize rather than just keep moving and copying.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, because the other thing is, if you're waiting 3 weeks for that report, by the time the report's there, the numbers are out of date, so you might as well not have it, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of users don't even ask the question because they know if they need it within those 3 weeks, they need something in 2 days' time or today. There's no point in asking the question. A lot of the demand is not even apparent to the IT demands, the IT team at the moment, just because of that lag. Exactly as you say, Lee.
Yeah. I mean, aside from that timeliness, that agility piece, I mean, what other kind of, I guess, key foundational features do you see these business operations needing? You know, data's flowing fast, right? So, speed, agility. Are there any other key factors that you see in there?
There are several things that I would encourage people to consider. And the first is security, clearly. So if you have data in sources which have got policies already in place, then you want to be able to, if you virtualize, you want to be able to push the credentials down to those sources so that you can use those policies to manage people's access. But we do also find, because you have a virtualized layer which is centralized and sits above the data sources, you have the ability in the virtual layer to provide the necessary security and obfuscation right down to individual row and column level, to either hide, mask, partially mask, whatever it might be. And depending on whether you've got other people accessing the original source, we often find that as people deploy virtualization over time, they put more and more of the security in the virtual layer rather than on the source. And of course, if the only access to the source is through the virtual layer, you don't need the policies on the source anymore. You can raise the security so that it's done in the virtual layer. And all the usual encryption that has to go with the encryption of the data at rest, the encryption of the data through SSL and so on needs to be part. So security is a key element. I think the second is performance. One of the key elements of data virtualization is the speed with which you can get a return on the query. And the reason that Denodo is by far the market leader in this space is the query optimization and pushdown that takes place in the virtual layer. There are a lot of tools out there who have the ability just to connect to things, but actually if you're going to go to a Hadoop cluster or to other sources and drag 100 million records across the enterprise into a BI server and then process the data there, it'll run extremely slowly. So you see a lot of tools where they want to move the data into a single location. Then you're almost back into the data warehouse model, moving and copying, and that brings its challenges. So that would be the second. The third is that you do sometimes find that some of the sources are vulnerable. You might have a trading platform, or in certain parts of the world it might be unreliable to get connectivity to those platforms, or it's just a stressed transactional system and you don't want to have BI queries. So there's a couple of things. One is that you have the ability in the virtual layer to control those queries, to say whether people can or can't run large queries, and you might have different privileges for different users. So your data scientists might be given more privilege than a business user, so they're not going to do a select star, but you can also control that inside the platform to make sure people don't drag huge amounts of data around the enterprise. But the second point, which is very important, is that there's a caching capability so that you can be very forensic. This is not caching in the sense that you bulk load everything from your data source to somewhere else. It's much more refined than that, and Denodo manages the caching. But essentially, you would, if let's say you had a high velocity data source in a transactional system, and lots of people want to look at it from a BI perspective, that would make a very good candidate for caching, and you'd cache it frequently. You might have another source which is less lower velocity, but still has lots of people looking at it. So you might cache that, but you cache it at a lower frequency. And then you might have a high velocity data set, which hardly anyone looks at. Well, in that case, don't cache it, because actually resource requirements of caching it every whatever minute or so would be better left alone, and you just get it when the occasional user wants to get to the data set. So the principle is that you can be very granular in your use of the caching, and it makes an important component. Clearly, if you just cache everything, you're back to an old-fashioned ETL data warehouse model, and you don't get the benefits. But if you use it in that more forensic way, and Denodo will offer up candidates and tell you where you might be spending too much time on processing, then you can use caching as an important element. But clearly, if you can, pushing the query down to the source is by far the best method to make sure that you get the fastest processing. Remembering, of course, the principle of data virtualization is do not move and copy data. So try and leave it at source, process as much as you can there. And the optimization that takes place in the virtual layer is really the key element, the magic sauce, if you like, that makes it performant and able to deliver in a fraction of the time that it might otherwise take. Even if you're querying a single source, Denodo will understand the table and schema layouts in the source. It may well be able to take a query and improve upon the way it's structured and push it down and get a better performance. So it works for most cases, yeah. Key.
Cool, great, thanks. And I guess trying to apply some of this to I think customer experience, if you like, you know, working through these sorts of programs with some of the customers that you're working with. I mean, what learnings do you see in the market from kind of existing data programs, if you like, and what do you think can be done to kind of improve those outcomes that people are seeing today? I mean, we see it with governance as an example. We ran a survey recently of 900 C-suite execs on governance programs, and about 35% of them felt that they got zero value from their governance program, right? So people are obviously investing heavily in these data programs, but maybe not getting the returns that they're looking for in one shape or form. So I guess in your experience, where do you see that coming from? What can be done to kind of improve on those outcomes, do you think?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the capabilities of data integration as a whole, there is no single silver bullet. I mean, there are vendors out there who will try and persuade you otherwise. But, you know, as I say, certainly in my lifetime, in the 35 years I've been in the industry, people have talked about these ideas, but actually it's a blend of components that make it successful and give you the best outcomes. So when people ask about data virtualization and the role that it has, it works for a lot of cases, but it's not for all cases. And that's because if you want to have historic data and trending data that's not persistent at the source, you do need to move and copy it somewhere where you've got an enduring version of the truth. And so historic and trending purposes do require an enterprise data warehouse. So I see data virtualization as part of a three-legged stool. You have ETL and data warehousing for the historic and trending data that you want to keep and curate for long term. Then you also have API tools sometimes used for transactional systems, typically high velocity, very small packets, often lots of them. And then you see the API data services tools being used quite extensively, particularly for event-driven processing, tools like Delboomi, MuleSoft, etc. Or it's Boomi now, isn't it? Not Delboomi. And then you have the data virtualization. So I see these, which we've already touched on, I see these as three legs of a stool, and they provide different types of data integration capabilities to complete the full picture. So in terms of learnings, we see when organizations come back to us to talk about what they've done with their Denodo platform and the value that they've got, they are typically reporting return on investment between 65 and 80 or sometimes 90% improvement in the development time, the deployment time, and most importantly, the agility that it brings not just to IT, but to the business. The speed with which you can bring in new products or services or get new insights, particularly in a fast changing market, are unparalleled. And the word I always hear from customers when they talk about their experiences is agility. So if an organization is worried about where do we start, we've got issues of governance, we've got issues of security, should we look at master data management, how are we going to manage centralized security, but federate so that we have empowered use of self-service, how are we going to do this? I would recommend looking at data virtualization alongside the ETL and of any event-driven application to application integration as being like the core, if you like, of a data integration strategy. And then you will get the values that you see. But I mean, typically, if you take, for example, a use case, and I can think of one of the world's largest microchip manufacturers, who we probably all know and perhaps are using at this moment in time. In fact, yes, I am. I see it's on the laptop. They estimate that they get a 90% improvement in the speed with which they can take stuff to business. And therefore, if you can bring a microchip to market 6 months earlier, which is typically the outcome, then if somebody like Dell, for example, is coming along with the next platform and they want a new microchip, if your microchip goes into that platform, that's worth hundreds of millions. So the speed with which you can deliver value to the business and help with improvement in terms of insights for products or services is really the key to strategic advantage. And most businesses now are using IT in a strategic, competitive way. It's no longer a back office function. The digital transformation that's taken place in most industries is profound. And many organizations now could almost be called IT companies because of the importance and the capabilities they have for delivering value to the shareholders is actually through technology rather than the traditional aspects of whatever their business might be, whatever industry they might have been in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's great. And I think, last question for today, really, last piece to cover off. I mean, we were talking about this earlier offline, but we were both at last week's Gartner Data Analytics Summit in London, which was great. And there was a lot being made about data fabric, data mesh. What is it? How does it? What are these things? And obviously, Denodo had a very successful talk at the show in this kind of vein. So I guess to close it out, it'd be great to get your view on data mesh, data fabric. What are they? How do they differ? Why do we care?
Yeah,
and go from there. If that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly I found that was an excellent presentation. We had a lot of people to the stand. It was actually by Landesbanken, which is an Icelandic bank who have already implemented data mesh very successfully. And we're talking very candidly about the challenges they had, how they use data virtualization to provide that capability as an enabler, if you like, and what the outcomes have been and what they're going to do next. So if people are interested, I would strongly recommend catching up on the recordings of that if you're able to get access from the Gartner and Data Analytics Conference. So that would certainly be worth looking at. I think the challenge that some people have is that data fabrics and data mesh sound very similar. A mesh and a fabric, they both sound like some sort of malleable blanket that sits over the data and provides some form of access, when actually they're really quite different. And data fabrics have been promoted for a while now. Very much a proven architecture, and you can think of it as architecture of components, of technologies that enable data integration across an enterprise. And they have all the components and therefore a multitude of different products that provide the functions that we've touched on very briefly, like data quality, MDM, data catalogs, data integration, data virtualization, and so on. And on all of the elements that sit around those. And there are a number of architectural diagrams you can find that talk about the data fabric. A data mesh is more of a concept which combines the people, the policies, and the processes. And it's not so much just about the technology, but it talks about the way you can take a centralized ownership and governance and move to a decentralized or federated model where you have ownership of the data sitting in domains or business functions typically. And instead of having a tightly coupled model, you move to these distributed frameworks. So these individual domains, who clearly have a better understanding of their own local business needs or their functional business needs, they're able to create the semantic models, the data models that they need, and access the data that they want to make their business run most efficiently. So it's moving to this domain model as a priority, and the creation of data as a product. So they create elements which can be used by their own teams, but have the potential to be used across other areas. Now, if you federate and have no control, then you have no interoperability. So data mesh also talks about the interoperability and the need for a centralized capability, which allows for that interoperability, for the governance, for the naming standards, the conventions, the policies and the process sit around the use of the data, so you have consistency across the business. If you had a domain that came up with some bright idea that then could be used across the rest of the group or by another domain, you want to have the ability to be able to share that model and for them to take advantage. The reason that Landesbanken were talking about data mesh is data virtualization is a capability that can enable a data mesh to be deployed successfully, as they have done in their own bank, and essentially they've been able to federate the responsibilities to their different lines of business, but still have a central empowered focus for the rest of the organization, and it's clearly been very successful, but not just for them, but for a lot of organizations. And we have now over 1,000 enterprises using Denodo in various use cases, and data mesh as a concept is now being quite widely adopted by many of them, to allow for this federation without losing the control. It's getting that balance. You don't want to centralize, you don't want the Wild West where it's a free-for-all, and the balance of being able to have a virtualized layer allows you the IT control, but the empowerment for self-service and agile BI that the business needs.
It's I mean, like I say, it's a hot area for a lot of people at the moment. So thanks for the I guess the insight and the overview there, Charles. That's awesome. Thank you.
Pleasure.
So I guess at that point we're kind of running top of time. So all it really leads me to do is say one, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I think it's been super informative, really, really useful, and hopefully the people watching will find it that way. If any of the guys watching this want to get in touch, you can find out more at denodo.com, or you can get in touch with us at nephostechnologies.com, and one of the team will be more than happy to help. And there will be some other things coming from us in due course with the guys at Denodo, particularly around some kind of use case documentation and these sorts of things. So thanks again, Charles. Really appreciate it. And
thank you, Lee. Very much appreciated. And I think, on that last point about implementation, working with an organization like Nephos is very key to us and to our clients. So we're delighted to be working with you, and look forward to helping some of your viewers with their requirements as well.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks very much.